Tonight is August 14, 2020, and the Tucson Astrologers Guild is proud to present Zane B. Stein, who has pioneered research into Chiron and is considered the leading authority on this minor planet. His book, Essence and Application, A View from Chiron, is still the most widely read text on the subject. He's currently seeking to unravel the meanings of other Centaurean bodies and the Trans-Neptunians. He began studying astrology in 1969 and has shared his astrological knowledge, giving lectures throughout the USA, Canada, Great Britain, and Ireland. He's also lectured throughout Australia, where he now lives with his wife, Lynette Malone, who has opened a school of astrology in the Perth area. He can be reached by email. You have that MailChimp email I sent you with his email address, one snail mail address. If you don't have it, just contact me. Anyway, we're very excited to hear what Zane has to present tonight. So we give him a round of applause and welcome Zane.
Hello, everybody. So let me say good evening to you. It's good morning from Australia. It's now 10:35 in the morning here, so I did not have to get up too early, which I appreciate. And just, I don't know if you can, if you see my friend here, this is my, he's going to help me with if I, get stuck on anything about the centaurs. So I'm going to get ready to start my slideshow here, so just bear with me one moment. All right, so I'm calling this yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and probably should have called it today, yesterday, and tomorrow, because I'm going to start talking about some things that are going on today, show how Chiron is at the root of a lot of them, and where they came from, and also how Chiron today is manifesting in these things. I'm not going to go over Chiron's mythology. It's a worthwhile topic, but we could talk all day about the myths. If you're not familiar with the myths of the wisest of all the centaurs, it would be a good thing to do in your spare time. There's a ton of stuff on him on the internet. So, as Chiron goes from sign to sign, two things occur. One thing is that the world is faced with a new set of problems to solve, or new variations of problems that they thought had been resolved already. Some of these become much more in your face as Chiron moves into the following sign. And the other thing that happens is that the world is forced to look at old problems that have been left unresolved and need to be dealt with. And this is important. The problems that become in your face when Chiron enters a sign don't suddenly come into being out of nowhere. Most likely they have been brewing beneath the surface for quite some time. Often they start to percolate up during the sign right before the present sign. But when Chiron enters a new sign, the proverbial kid gloves come off, and nowhere is this more evident than when Chiron shifts from Pisces into Aries. This accentuates the dichotomy between self-interest and the concern for others. You think about Aries as self-interest and the opposing sign in Libra. It can amplify the desire for peace and the urge to go to war. Problems are emphasized that are keeping people from expressing themselves or their viewpoints. Problems also are in one's face resulting from too much self-centeredness. Sometimes the two poles seem to coexist, sometimes they clash, and when they clash, it can be quite violent. There are movements of large numbers of people that can become an issue, and people take sides for and against. Perhaps nothing is more symbolic of this transition than what happens when the seeds as it approaches spring. During Pisces, the ground begins to warm, the water seeps down below the surface, and the seeds begin to germinate. You don't see this happening though. And then one day, wait, let me show you. This is the Chiron going from Pisces to Aries. All right, so that's Chiron and Aries just now. And so when the world sees Chiron entering into Aries, stuff has been germinating. It's been going on beneath the surface. And as you'll see when I go over some things that are happening now, they didn't suddenly spring like parthenogenesis out of the ether, out of inanimate objects. They were brewing. The sign Chiron is in describes how the chironic energy is expressed. And Aries is a sign of action, is a sign of do it now, today. With Chiron and Pisces, things began to come together, groups coalesced. But as Chiron shifted signs, the Aryan keywords of I and me became the theme, with the corresponding need for the world to recognize them. Pay attention to me. So we're going to look at a few themes in today's world that are manifesting due to Chiron and Aries. And I say a few because I would need a much longer talk to go over all the things that I see that are Aryan Chiron. We'll start off looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. And a few other movements. And well, you'll see. Following that, I'll show you some of the same themes that I just went through the last two times Chiron was in Aries, and you'll see, I hope, the connection between the themes that are going on now and what happened the last couple of times. One pattern that emerges during Chiron and Aries is how to deal with movement of large groups of people in things like immigration. You all know that one of the issues that Trump got into power on was a promise to do something about the immigration problem. During the previous Chiron and Aries period, 3/4 of the American public wanted something to be done about immigration, and half of them demanded it be decreased. And in the Chiron and Aries time before that, we had some laws passed. Emergency Quota Act restricted immigrants, and the National Origins Acts of 1924. So what Trump wants to do is part of a cycle, no matter what you feel about his attitudes about the immigrants. And in one way or another, this kind of thing is worldwide. It's not just the US. Now, as you know, Chiron is currently in Aries. It dwelled in that sign a bit from April 17th to September 25th, 2018. Then it journeyed back into Pisces. But on February 18th last year, it decided to take Aries seriously, and it won't see Taurus until June of 2026. Chiron's orbit is extremely elliptic. Like Pluto, it stays in some signs longer than others. And when it is in the sign Aries, it is the furthest distance from the sun, and therefore it's the longest time in Aries of any of the signs. For about 8 years, Chiron goes through the sign of Aries, and that's what we're in now. Just to give you a comparison, when Chiron is closest to the sun, it's in Libra, and it zooms to that in about a year and a half. So let's look at some of the things that we cannot unsee, things that are in our face now that Chiron is in Aries, and events that led up to the Aryan breaking through the surface. For example, I will be talking about the pandemic in a bit. Think of those people who simply refuse to wear a mask, refuse to social distance, and how that impacts all those who wear the mask and are trying to think of the larger good. Self-interest versus interest of humanity. So let's go back to 2012. On February 26th, a community was enraged when an unarmed black teenager was shot dead by a neighborhood watch member. And people were calling for justice. News spread around the country, and people from all over called for the shooter's arrest. George Zimmerman's trial for second-degree murder and manslaughter began on June 10th, 2013, and on July 13th, after deliberating for 16 hours, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all the charges. This verdict was read around 10 p.m. Chiron and Pisces in the first house might not seem particularly significant here at the time of the verdict, with just a trine to Mercury in Cancer and one to the North Node in Scorpio, but add one more set of points to the chart, and Chiron really stands out. It's right on the anti-vertex. For those unfamiliar with the vertex, anti-vertex, they are an additional pair of angles. Astrologer Alice Portman says that these angles stimulate an awareness of being part of the universe rather than a separate entity. And if a planet is conjunct one of the points, it can become an overriding force that makes that planet stronger than anything else in the chart, even stronger than something conjunct the ascendant or midheaven. Many astrologers have experienced these angles as events that seem fated or turning points, and people connected with them are those which in one way or another change one's life. A colleague of mine said that when he meets somebody with Chiron conjunct their anti-vertex, that person comes across as having a powerful agenda, focused, and they are going to do what they feel they need to do, and they don't give a hoot what you or anyone else thinks about it. So the seeds of a movement were planted over many years. The event marked by the seedling bursting through from the shell and begin to grow. We'll talk more about that in a minute. In Los Angeles, an activist named Alicia Garza was having a conversation with a colleague on Facebook when the news broke about the acquittal. Shortly after 8 p.m. Pacific time, she reacted with a tweet that gave a name to the rage she was feeling. I continue to be surprised at how little Black Lives Matter. And her friend Patricia Cullors replied with hashtag Black Lives Matter, a slogan that soon spread quite rapidly. If news of the acquittal was at the root of the movement, these tweets perhaps marked the actual birth. And the grand trine involving Chiron in the second, which is the house of what you value, Mercury in the sixth, which would be the tools that are used, and nodes in the 10th, right on the midheaven, the public identity, here becomes much more significant. The movement now had a name, something to stand for, and a method to get the name out to the world. Looking at the Black Lives Matter chart in relation to the USA chart, Chiron was in the US third house, which would be news, almost exactly trying the US sun, quincunx at Saturn in Libra. Clearly the news was about justice or a lack of it, and the Black Lives Matter sun was square the USA Chiron. I don't have the birth times for these two, but just thought I'd bringing their charts just for a second. Uh, Alicia's Chiron trine her Sun and Mercury is almost exactly sextile Chiron for the Black Lives Matter and conjunct that chart's South Node. And Patricia's Chiron is the handle of a finger of God pattern involving Saturn and Pluto in Libra and Neptune in Sagittarius, and it's trine the Moon in the Black Lives Matter's chart. So the Moon began to grow with Chiron and Pisces. Speaking from personal experience, though, I hadn't heard of it at this time, and it was growing, but hadn't reached the attention of the world at large. It took Chiron moving into Aries for the seedling to burst through the ground and become something everyone on Earth knew about. I often think of Aries as being a newborn's first breath, which marks its first moment of independent existence. George Floyd was a Black man arrested by a police officer who lost his life when the officer knelt on his neck for nearly 8 minutes. News footage shown around the world clearly heard George gasping right before he died, "I can't breathe." Nothing could be more clear statement of his life force being taken from him than that. Chiron was important in George's chart, opposing his Sun-Uranus conjunction. Now, decades of people were born with Chiron opposition Uranus. It marked the generational influence, but it was very personal because George's Sun was connected to it. I'd like to focus for a moment on those who have a natal Sun opposition Chiron. In a natal chart, there's usually a deep wound when it comes to fairness and or equality, to the point that the person feels the need to prove they're equal or just as good as others. It is often that they feel they always have to defend themselves in one way or another. Those that learn from this aspect learn how to choose their battles. Those that don't suffer the consequences. And I won't dwell on the chart, except that I feel that what I've read about George is that he was not exactly wise in the battles he chose, and that's why he ended up arrested. George's Chiron, 18 Aries 29, was not too far from the U.S.'s natal Chiron. So his Sun Uranus opposed it. Clearly, he struck a chord in the U.S. fourth house, here on our home turf. When he died, transiting Chiron and Aries made itself heard. It was near the bottom of the U.S. chart, very closely square to Eris. And you could say that made a double whammy because transiting Eris was still an orb of a conjunction to the U.S. Chiron, something that had been going on for years. It had been moving back and forth in exact conjunction with that Chiron from 2001 to 2006. And that period, 2001, began when riots started in Cincinnati after a police officer shot a 19-year-old Black man. Following the death of George Floyd, the movement went worldwide, and there were quickly large-scale Black Lives Matter protests in Europe and cities like London, Brussels, Paris, all within the orb of that chart's Chiron line. All right, let's look at another movement now that ramped up speed when Chiron moved into Aries. Tarana Burke grew up in a low-income family in a poor neighborhood, and she suffered being raped and sexually assaulted both as a child and as a teenager. She got involved with the community, working to help to improve the lives of girls who had suffered extreme hardships. She tells a story that while she was working at a youth camp, one of the girls came to see her privately. She needed to talk to someone about the sexual violence she'd been through. Tarana says, but I wasn't ready. When she started to disclose, I told her to see somebody else. She basically pushed her away. But it weighed very heavy on her, and she began thinking about her own life, what she had survived and how she got through it. She felt a lot of guilt. She said, why couldn't I just tell her me too? She realized that that was what had helped her. having someone empathize with her. She began working with survivors of sexual violence and formed a foundation to help. And in 2006, she started a MySpace page. If you're not familiar with MySpace, at one point it was bigger than any other social media. It used to get 100 million visitors a month. The response from adult women was overwhelming. This was the birth of the Me Too movement, but it was behind the scenes in a lot of ways. Word of mouth brought people there. You would see it occasionally, somebody with a T-shirt that said Me Too, but it hadn't exploded uh, around the world yet. I don't have a birth time for Trina, so this is a noon chart. It's clear that no matter what time of day she was born, she has a close Sun quincunx Chiron, uh, the widest orbit possible that day would have been 39 minutes. People with this aspect have an innate ability to tune into the undercurrents, the vibrations. They can easily pick up the subtext behind what people are saying. But this is tied to a Chiron wound. And until they begin to heal, they tend to push away from conscious awareness. They tend to feel very uncomfortable with what they're picking up. They don't want to deal with it. It hurts. It reminds them of their own pain. As they heal, they develop the ability to listen to others and then guide them through their own pain. Year 2006 began with a transiting Chiron passing over her natal Jupiter around the time she decided to start putting together the web page. Perhaps was even more important was the fact that Saturn in Leo and Chiron in Aquarius both squared her natal Mars more than once that year. Saturn square Mars was a frustrating time, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, feeling the need to do something, feeling blocked that she didn't know what to do. And Chiron square Mars is like a raw nerve or a wound rubbed open and a need to do something because it hurts so much. Note that her Chiron is in Aries, so the problem that she needs to deal with in life are colored by this. And you find a lot of the people who become very, very active when Chiron is in Aries is like they're coming home because they have Chiron in Aries in the natal chart. So this is now actress Alyssa Milano had been active in many causes at least as far back as the 1980s. In 2017, she gave energy to this Me Too movement, or as some say, rekindled it. After Harvey Weinstein was expelled from the Academy for sex crimes against women in the film industry, she felt moved to do something, and the suggestion of a friend, she posted a message on Twitter encouraging survivors of sexual harassment and assault to post hashtag #MeToo as a status update so that women had an opportunity to be heard without having to go into details about their stories if they didn't want to. The time of the tweet is recorded in her Twitter account, so we can do a chart for that exact moment. Here you see a prominent Chiron in the 7th house in close opposition to Mars in the 1st, and the two are also parallel, so that increases the strength of the aspect, and they form a T-square with Saturn in the 4th. Chiron in the 7th is a focus on defending the rights of others to express themselves. Many people born with this position become fighters in defense of justice and fairness for others, or mediators in disputes, and they tend, at the very least, to take on controversial issues on purpose. Opposition Mars, they almost cannot help themselves. They are fighters, and is often fueled by a lot of pent-up anger of their own. And the square to Chiron intensifies the need to fight because the person feels they are being blocked, frustrated, or stopped at every turn. And often it is the status quo which they feel is blocking them. This is the kind of energy that was released at this tweet. Now, Alyssa is another Chiron and Aries fighter. Look how close Chiron is to Eris. They're both 12 degrees Aries. She is someone with a deep wound tied into what psychologists call the separation trauma. Way too young, she experienced a loss of innocence. I don't know if you know much about her, but she started acting at age 7. So she was one of those children that did not have much of a childhood. For years, she would say she had a happy childhood, but she was keeping some stuff inside. It also is conjunct her IC, and clearly there are wounds connected with one of her parents, either feeling that she could not talk to her parent, or the parent just didn't have time to listen, or she was afraid to talk to the parent about things, or she just felt let down in general. She started acting at age 7 and began a regular on TV show at age 10. So it's likely she just couldn't make her parents understand she wanted to be like other kids. She wanted to have fun. And then in 2018, she responded to a Trump tweet, one of the many. This one, Trump was pretty much blowing off the charges against Brett Kavanaugh, who was in the running to be a Supreme Court judge. He had been accused of raping somebody, and Trump just blew it off, saying if it had happened, then, she would have come up and said something. This is what Alyssa said. Hey, Trump, listen the fuck up. I was sexually assaulted twice. Once when I was a teenager. I never filed a police report, and it took me 30 years to tell my parents. If any survivor of sexual assault would like to add to this, please do so in the replies. #MeToo. When she posted the tweet, the transiting T-square of Mars, Saturn, and Chiron was hitting her sun and ascendant. Also notice Pluto right on her north nodes, so it had been squaring her natal Chiron in recent months. The Me Too movement was beginning to be heard, but it took Chiron moving to Aries before it exploded across the country. Harvey Weinstein was a powerful, influential film producer and a studio executive, but he'll probably be best remembered as the man who used his powerful position to sexually harass and abuse 80 women. With Chiron conjunct the moon, Harvey was a child terrified of things outside his control, and he especially was afraid of his own mother. Clearly, he never healed from these wounds, and he expressed this by wanting to be in total control of all the women in his life. The accusations began in 2017, and he was fired from his company because of them. When the news first broke about his abuse, transiting Chiron was applying conjunction to Harvey's natal 5th house sun. And in the following months, Chiron passed over his sun. Then Chiron entered into Aries. Shortly after that, with Chiron at 1 Aries 43, he turned himself into the police. After going through the formal process of fingerprinting, having a mugshot, etc., he was officially arrested when Chiron was in the 10th house conjunct the midheaven. And then this brought the news to the attention of the entire world. And the Me Too movement took off. I don't think you'll find anybody in the world who has connection with the television or the internet who hasn't heard about the Me Too movement now. This is a movement that I'm particularly fond of. The He for She movement was initiated on September 20th, 2014 by the United Nations, with Chiron 14 Pisces 48, quincunx Jupiter 14 Leo 03. Basically, this is an aspect, Chiron quincunx Jupiter, where you're constantly questioning beliefs. It's also opposed Venus and Virgo. Chiron opposing Venus is a woundedness when it comes to feelings of self-worth, feeling the need to always compare one's own worth to others. This is a solidarity movement for the advancement of gender equality. It's grounded in the idea that gender inequality is an issue that affects all people, socially, economically, and politically. It seeks to involve men and boys in achieving equality by taking action against negative gender stereotypes. I added my voice this month and see that over 2 million people had done so before me. Since Chiron has moved into Aries, there has been a major increase in men of all walks of life publicly showing their support for gender equality. You didn't see much of that before Chiron in Aries. And in fact, sometimes TV shows would make fun of the guy who supported his wife for equality, like he was being wimpy or something, you know. You see now at protests, men openly carrying signs showing their support. Perhaps even more significant is the number of male heads of nations that have given their full support to this he for she movement. The president of Finland, the president of Iceland, the president of Romania, the prime minister of Japan, the president of Ghana, the president of Malawi, all of these and more have openly given their support, some in official proclamations for this movement, and that they will do everything they can. I guess this kind of goes in hand with the Me Too movement. But Chiron in Aries has much, much more to confront us with. And this next one that Chiron in Aries focuses on impacts all humanity with no respect for race, sex, or other class. Chiron in Aries is making us realize there is an immediacy to the action that must be taken on climate change. July 2019 was Earth's all-time hottest month in recorded history. Records were broken in 22 of the world's nations, temperature records, and 151 nations set all-time monthly heat records that year. Only one set of all-time monthly cold records out of all the nations that were reported. Increasingly alarming environmental warnings show we are at a crisis point now. Drought, forest fires, extreme weather around the globe. Those that are speaking of this issue are demanding to be heard now. And perhaps no one leads the way in this more vocally than Greta Thunberg. This young lady was born with Chiron conjunct her sun. This is the aspect I think of most when I think of the word maverick. Someone who does not wear the brand of the herd but follows their own path. And a Capricorn, she needs to take a stand for what she is sure is right and can reach people on all different levels to motivate them. It makes her a force to be reckoned with, and in the process, she can force people to feel they must take sides. So you've probably seen some people criticizing her very openly in public, just as you've seen many people support her. You can't remain indifferent to a Chiron conjunct Sun person. In August 2018, with Chiron at around 2 Aries, she staged a protest outside of the Swedish parliament, holding a sign that read, translated, "School Strike for Climate." On March 15th last year, a global strike was organized in 125 countries, 2,200 communities. Chiron was 1 Aries 23. I have seen a number of sites theorizing that her ascendant is Capricorn, and I've rectified an unknown birth time to coincide with Chiron squaring, Chiron in the first house, and with the transiting Chiron squaring her ascendant. If you happen to have watched the News Summit when she was at 2019 United Climate Action Summit, you could not possibly forget when she addressed the powers that be by exclaiming, "How dare you?" That Mars in the 10th house on the rectified chart seems to express that to me, but also that Chiron in the first house. And there's the issue of pollution, which itself has some connection with climate change. We've talked about it on and off for years, but when Chiron entered Aries, the issue started demanding our attention. The Health Effects Institute published the State of Global Air in 2019. Some of their key findings: air pollution is the 5th leading risk factor for mortality worldwide. Air pollution contributes to more deaths than many better known risk factors such as malnutrition, alcohol use, and physical inactivity. Air pollution reduced life expectancy in 2017 by 1 year and 8 months on the average, and nearly half of the world's population were exposed to household air pollution. So this is one side of the pollution that we're looking at in 2020. Every year, 8 million metric tons of plastic enters the ocean, according to a study published by the World Economic Forum. This equates to a garbage truck full of plastic being dumped into the ocean every minute. There are currently 5 trillion pieces of plastic waste in the ocean. And it's not just the plastic, but what happens to it in there. It starts to break down, but never breaks down completely. It breaks down into microplastics, particles less than 5 millimeters in diameter. And more than 800 species of marine animals are affected by these plastics. You know, they swallow it when they're eating their food. It becomes in their system. You eat fish now, and chances are you're eating microplastics. All of these Chiron and Aries issues are important, but there's one in our face every day, no matter where we turn. The COVID-19 pandemic began after Chiron entered Aries. This gentleman who said, "I think the world should unite and focus on strong health systems to prepare the whole world to prevent epidemics, or if there is an outbreak, to manage it quickly, because viruses don't respect borders and they don't need visas." He had taken over the head of the World Health Organization in 2017, and that's when that statement was from. Chiron is very much an integral part of his chart, conjunct his Mercury and Sun, and possibly his Moon, opposing Uranus, Pluto, and Mars in Virgo, and square the lunar nodes. Here is someone who devotes his life to wanting to help people and speaks about the problems he sees. With all of that opposing his Chiron stellium, he often feels like he's speaking to a brick wall. Clearly, people did not listen to him in 2017. As I write this in early August, the COVID-19 pandemic has covered the world with almost 20 million infected and over 730,000 deaths. According to Chinese media, the earliest case of the virus was detected on September 17, 2019, a 55-year-old male from Hubei province. The chart for a detection of the illness may be as close as we can come to the birth chart of the pandemic. In addition to Chiron, I want to bring in another Centaurean body, Pholus. If you look at the chart in the 11th house, near the 12th house, that's a symbol for Pholus. Pholus was the second centaur discovered in 1992. And like Chiron, it is a body that crosses borders. Chiron crosses the orbit of Saturn and goes closer to us than Saturn and almost reaches Uranus. Pholus crosses Uranus's orbit and almost gets to Neptune. And the reason I want to bring this up is that time after time we have seen Pholus show up when it comes to diseases, especially viruses. The icon the image for a virus T cell, I think it's called, looks very similar to the Follis uh, symbol. And if you imagine uh, the virus injecting its material into a cell, you can see uh, like a little proboscis down between the two legs at the bottom of that symbol. Chiron makes a close aspect in the chart and applying square to a conjunction of Follis and Ceres. Chiron is, of course, the wound and the potential for the channel for healing. But in a square, there are blocks or obstacles to overcome before the healing can take place. Chiron is the principle of nurturing, Ceres is the principle of nurturing and connecting with nature and the earth. When it is at its best, there is an environment of love that encourages growth. But it can also be where we feel intense grief, where letting go is seemingly forced upon us, where we can lose a family member figuratively or literally. Here, Ceres is merged with Follis. And as I mentioned, Follis has been associated with viruses. As you may be aware, those viruses that result in disease are so virulent because they insert their own DNA into the cell, disable the cell's DNA, and turn into a factory to create more viruses. So here, Follis' closeness to Ceres tries to take over the nurturing growth and get it to produce more viruses instead, and square to Chiron, healing is a major obstacle. The world at large didn't hear about the virus until 31 December that year, which happened to be shortly after an eclipse, which I'll mention later. China informed the World Health Organization that they had 44 cases of patients with pneumonia of an unknown etiology. Mercury had just passed exact conjunction with Follis, separating from its square to Chiron. The Chinese released the news a bit after the fact, after they found out. So the aspect is just passed, kind of fits the situation. And we often wondered whether things would be different had they been quicker in reporting the issue. The Chinese researchers finally verified that this was a new type of coronavirus on January 7th. Ceres, which was square Chiron in the first chart, is now part of a conjunction with Saturn and Pluto. And if you look at the top of the chart, and these are noon charts, so you can't look at the houses, you can see the stellium starts with Follis and ends with Pluto there. The moon is moving to oppose Mars, sextile Chiron on the way. In a horary, they say that the moon translated the light from Chiron to Mars, perhaps enabling the doctors to begin to know exactly what they would be dealing with. It was officially named COVID-19 on February 11th, with Venus separating from a square to the Follis to Follis, and I lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. A month later, on 11th March, the outbreak was officially declared a pandemic. Chiron is closely square the lunar nodes, what some call active bending, with Follis conjunct the south node. And this happened to be conjunct a December 26, 2019 solar eclipse, which was 4 Capricorn 06. It occurred just before the China told the World Health Organization. The question has been raised, why has the US suffered worse from the virus than any other country? If you use the chart for the US, which is the one arrived at by Dane Rudyard, which is very similar to the Sibley chart, the birth of the pandemic saw Chiron conjunct the 4th house cusp, and it has been moving through the house of home and family ever since. It has also squared Venus, the ruler of the 10th, and Jupiter, ruler of the ascendant. And if you're wondering about the connection between Chiron and the pandemic, there were also pandemics the last 2 times Chiron is in Aries, which I will mention a little later. Okay. Yeah, it's not all movements and tragedies and stuff with Chiron and Aries. One of the things that Chiron and Aries seems to do is talk about positive changes that improve our lives. We discover new ways to solve problems, but in the process, we find that we do have new problems spring up that didn't happen, that we didn't exist before the new technology. Uh, if you think about your lives, you can think of how technology has changed your own life and society. And in this Chiron Aries, we are seeing just how much technology is going to be changing our lives for decades to come. Many of the technologies that have been promised for decades have been constantly improving and are now reaching the point of maturity. Some experts say we're about to enter the fourth industrial revolution. A few of the things that are happening. Artificial intelligence. It's been a topic of sci-fi for a long time, but now with Chiron and Aries has evolved into a practical solution for improving productivity and effectiveness. On the other hand, think of all the potential problems. If you're like me, you were a big fan of the Terminator. You know about artificial intelligence, it's scary stuff. There's something called edge computing. The easiest way to describe this, imagine storing data not far away in some humongous server, but a sort of a mini cloud almost right outside your door. Response times will be lightning fast, bandwidth usage will be cut down exponentially. But there are a lot of potential problems, some we can't even foresee, about having this cloud right outside your door, basically. And then there's quantum computing. I don't claim to be a physicist and understand it in depth, but my understanding, computers that we use today have a limit size. They're getting smaller and smaller, and the chips are getting smaller and smaller. 50 years after the ENIAC computer, which is basically the first major computer, the students at a university put the entire architecture of that room-sized computer on one chip. So they're getting smaller and smaller. But there's a physics limit. You can't go smaller than a certain size. They have now working with computers that seem to be able to use atoms to store data. And you can't go smaller than an atom. Quantum computers works an entirely different theme. It doesn't use zeros and ones. It uses a formula, which basically you plug data in, and so you can do thousands of calculations with a quantum computer that would only be able to do one with a standard computer. Size is no longer an issue because they don't have to keep getting smaller and smaller anymore with quantum computers. However, they're just starting to get use quantum computers, and who knows what's going to happen. Potential negatives, problems that we didn't have, that we don't even know are down the road because of it. Okay, so I think this is a good time to stop and take some questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this and take a look at the chat room. So I'll see if I can answer any questions that are in there. And if you have any, now's a good time to add them. Okay, here's one. I've noticed my Chiron is 1 Capricorn and Jupiter 6 Aries. Okay, here's a person who has Chiron, Jupiter, and midheaven very close in Aries and has transit of Chiron hitting these. And says it makes me wonder if COVID and their other problems she had could be a part of this. Her natal Chiron is 1 Capricorn in the 6th house. I'm very curious how it all fits together. Okay, as I mentioned, Chiron is involved with the pandemics, and Chiron, when it transits in square to Chiron, is a turning point in one way or another. So you've recently had Chiron square your natal Chiron. So that is a turning point. Chiron is also the planet that helps us to find a way to heal. And so when Chiron passes over these planets, it precipitates problems that have been brewing, which is why your lower resistance probably allow the COVID to enter into your system and the other problems. But it also gave you the opportunity to look for new ways to deal with the issues. Had you gotten sick at some other time, it's possible that you may not have found these alternative things to help yourself. I talked with you briefly before the lecture, and you said that you had changed your diet, for example. And one of the things that Chiron taught, the mythological Chiron, was about eating the proper foods, using food as medicine, things like that. So yes, I would say that Chiron transit was directly involved with what you've been going through. Okay. Here, somebody said Fuller's discovery degree is 29 Cancer, which is known as the billionaire's degree. I wonder what that means. I can't speak about the billionaire's degree because I haven't researched it. I know there was a famous Wall Street mogul that said millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do, or something like that. So it's possible that there is something to that. But as far as Pholus being in there, I don't see a connection. I would have to research it to see if I could find a tie-in. So sorry, I can't answer that one. Somebody else replied that more billionaires in Cancer and Capricorn than any other sign. So maybe there is a connection, or maybe just coincidence because so many of them are in Cancer and Capricorn. I've also heard that there are the most Virgo billionaires. So how may we use Pholus transits to predict the growing or lessening of viruses, either in the collective or individually? Okay. Basically, if you can imagine for a minute that you have a bottle of soda pop that you had shaken up, and you pull the top off, and everything just kind of explodes. You know, when you're a kid, you might have done that and then aimed it away so you could create like a water gun effect out of your pop bottle. This is what happens with a Pholus transit. Basically, when we see a Pholus transit, in a significant aspect to an outer body, it usually means that there is some kind of release of, it may not be a pandemic, it could be a new virus coming to our attention, it could be a suddenly a virus starts spreading that we thought we had tamed or thought we had control. Like a virus that we thought we had completely had licked, suddenly there are cases springing up around the world. So how we can use FOL is to watch the transits and be more prepared, protect yourself more during these transits, make sure you're eating properly, getting enough sleep. And if the medical establishment used astrology, they could become more observant at this time, knowing that something is going to be coming out, something is going to be manifesting. Here, all viruses have a lifespan. The outbreak period for major viruses is 17 years, and when there's a solar minimum, every 11.2 years, this contributes to the spread of the disease. Oh, I meant to say every 17 years, a new virus. SARS virus happened 17 years ago. That may be very true, but it's not necessarily that there is a pandemic every 17 years. And some viruses are very, very minor in their impact, and some are much more major. So the fact that there is an outbreak of major viruses at 17 years I could see that as one important factor, but some of them are very, very short-lived. Some of them, they mutate very quickly and they don't have a long effect on people. Let's see here. I've got natal Chiron 20 Pisces opposite my Virgo sun. Yes, fairness and equality have been a theme. Well, that wasn't a question, but okay, thank you. I know a lot of people with Chiron in close aspect to their sun, either conjunction or opposition. I seem to attract them for some reason or other. And some of my favorite experiences in the astrological world have been with people who had Chiron sun aspects. You may have heard of a gentleman named Neil Mickelson. He was basically brought the astrological ephemeris into the computer age. He generated the first computerized ephemeris book for sale, with precision. And he had Chiron conjunct the sun. And one of the things that fondest memories of working with him was that he decided after our conversations that he would add Chiron to his ephemeris. So the man with Chiron conjunct the sun was the first ephemeris publisher who added Chiron to the ephemeris. Question: in some of the discussion on sexual energy, in some of the discussion, sexual energy is an important factor to events. Mars, Aries are often involved in the discussion regarding Chiron, while Scorpio seems to be somewhat sidelined. How do you feel sexual identity and action associated with Aries is a factor in these patterns with Chiron? Well, I have to give that one some thought. That's not a light question to answer. I will tell you that I've often thought of Aries as the side of Mars we see most quickly, most easily, and Scorpio as the stuff that we might not see right away that might be initially below the surface, but they're both Mars. And Mars is definitely a sexual influence. But I'm not sure about Scorpio being sidelined, except for the fact that quite often you don't see it right away. Maybe if you want to clarify your question a little bit, I'm not sure I'm quite understanding what you're asking. That was from Dan. So Dan, if you want to add a little more. Thanks, Tom. Tom said JP Morgan was the billionaire who said that quote about billionaires use astrology, and his astrologer was Evangeline Adams. Okay, we'll take one more question, and then I'm going to go back to our talk. Does it mean anything different if Chiron is retrograde, either in an event chart or a birth chart? What might you have to say about those of us who were born around the time of Pholus was discovered, considering it was during a huge Capricorn stellium that's a planet opposite Pholus? Oh, two separate questions. I'll think about the second one. I'll try to answer that later if I have time. But the first one, Chiron retrograde. Yeah. When you're born, obviously Chiron is either retrograde or direct. And because of where Chiron is, it's when it's retrograde, it can be retrograde for several months in a row, maybe 5 months. So you have a large percentage of the population, not quite half, have retrograde. And there is a difference. A lot of times the feeling of being different, of being a little bit out of sync with other people that so often felt with Chiron is quite internalized with Chiron retrograde, whereas when it's direct in a chart, you tend to think it much more consciously. You see how you are different. You go over in your mind the ways that you don't quite fit. And when Chiron progresses from retrograde to direct at birth, after birth, sometimes this period you go through a change where you begin to connect more with the outside world, and the feeling different, you are able to connect with actual events in your life rather than just as an internal thing. All right. I hope that sort of answered your question, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again, and we'll continue. All right. So, the last time Chiron was in Aries was 1968-76. And so it's the main factor, or one of the main factors in the period we call the 70s. Many historians refer to the 70s, especially the first half, as a pivot of change in world history, especially in relation to world economies. Let's look at the few of the things that were in your face during those years. So we're going to look at a few of these things on this. Author Tom Wolfe described these times as the me decade to emphasize how the focus was increasingly on individualism, fitting for a time when Chiron is in Aries. I talked about Black Lives Matter for today. Well, this Chiron in Aries was an extremely important time in the fight for civil rights. Martin Luther King, who had been a leading figure in the civil rights movement when Chiron was in Pisces, was assassinated with Chiron in Aries. On April 11th, 1968, there was a landmark Civil Rights Act signed into law that made it a federal crime to injure, intimidate, harm, or force, using a threat of force, anyone because of their race, creed, or national origin. It also made it a crime to discriminate in the sale, rental, or financing of housing due to race, religion, national origin, or disabilities. There was also a huge section which gave Native Americans the same civil rights as they'd been given to other Americans. And if you, like me, have memories of the 60s, and I do have a few, unlike that joke which says if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. I do remember that there was a lot going on when it comes to race relations, and I remember the Black Power fist, for example. So it was definitely a time where the Black people were trying to get attention for the injustices and for the inequalities. We talked about the Me Too movement. Well, this Chiron and Aries was also a time when women were becoming more liberated economically, and this impacted how they saw themselves and thus the way they presented themselves. I remember that Margaret Thatcher became the first female to lead a major political party in the United Kingdom. And later on, when Chiron moved into the next sign, she became the head of the country. There was a lot of protests for women's liberation going on at this time. It was in the, excuse me, it was only in the late 60s and particularly the 70s that sexual violence, including sexual child abuse, emerged as significant social and political issues in Australia and overseas. So both sex, as far as sexism and also sexual abuse were very much in your face at this time, Chiron and Aries. I don't know if you were one of the people at the first Earth Day observance, but I was in Philadelphia. And I remember feeling that we were about to do something major for the world. That all these people were coming together. We were going to do something to help the environment. And there were some things that were done, but obviously not enough, or it wouldn't happen that this Chiron and Aries, we were again focusing on the issue. Also, not just the first Earth Day, but the United States passed the Endangered Species Act during this Chiron and Aries. Now, right now, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. The last time Chiron was in Aries, we had to deal with the Hong Kong influenza pandemic. A pandemic is like we're fighting a war which we are poorly prepared for. Perhaps the reason it comes during Mars ruled Aries is to show us just how unprepared we are and to get us to fight to try and change things so it won't happen again. You know, human beings are very, very stubborn. We quite often don't learn our lessons, so we have to be told again and again. And I think each time Chiron becomes a little less patient with humanity, and just hopefully we survive through to the next Chiron in Aries. This Chiron in Aries was also a time of self-expression and uninhibitedness, a fascination with novelty and a fascination with new technologies. Now, I mentioned we have quantum computers and AI. The last time Chiron was in Aries, inventors were working on the technology that led to personal computers. And as you know, the first personal computer was a little bit later with Chiron and Taurus, but the explosion of research happened during Chiron and Aries. It was also explosion of electronic transmission of data, which blossomed into the internet. So that little quote there, information revolution, that comes from a page talking about this particular time period. We are in the midst of a change as profound as any that has gone before. So we're now in the same kind of thing. We're now in a period of, we're about to go through some very profound change as well as far as information. And let's go back to the previous Chiron cycle, which was 1918 to 1926. This is my favorite example of a transition from one sign to another. One of the silliest laws to pass in this Chiron Aries was the prohibition. To think about going from Pisces to Aries. They amended the Constitution to ban alcoholic beverages, which stimulated the entrepreneurs and criminals into action to provide booze in every way possible. The world was moving into the roaring 20s, or it was called in France the crazy years, a dynamic time. In the US and England, for example, floppers redefined the way women saw themselves and thus the way women presented themselves. It was a time of self-expression and uninhibitedness, a fascination with novelty, a fascination with new technologies. There was a more open attitude towards sexual freedom, including premarital sex. Not quite like the Black Lives Matter, but this period started off with something called the Red Summer of 1919. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been pretty much asleep for quite a few years, was reborn, became active, and they started a spree of terrorism, brutally attacking Black people. Lynchings occurred across the U.S. One event was an African teenager drowned in Lake Michigan after violating the unofficial segregation of Chicago's beaches, and he was stoned to death by a group of white youths. His death and the police refusing to arrest the white man who eyewitnesses identified as causing it sparked a week of rioting between groups of Black and white Chicagoans. Race riots broke out in D.C., Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, and Nebraska. And I think it's very funny. Somebody took the current feelings, deport all Eagles, build the wall nice and tall from Trump, and overlaid it on this picture here. The fight for basic rights was a huge part of this period. Women fought for and got the right to vote in the U.S. In another law, Native Americans were granted citizenship. The League of Nations, who was the forerunner of the United Nations, introduced the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. It was the first international document which identified that children had any rights and connected child welfare principles with those rights. The environment, well, the Isaac Walton League is an American environmental organization that was founded in 1922 that promotes natural resource protection and outdoor recreation. The first conservation organization with a mass membership, the league had over 100,000 supporters by 1924. One of their successful efforts was the establishment of the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. Some of the other environmental issues that sprung up, the death of a textile worker from asbestosis was the first account of the disease coming from asbestos, an environmental exposure. There were also things that came into being at this time that later proved to be an environmental issue. Somebody named Thomas Midgley Jr. discovered that lead added to gasoline stopped the knocking in the cars. In spite of the fact that it was already known that lead had some toxic effects, it was added to petrol or to gasoline, and it took years and years before they removed it. The same scientist was also researching chlorofluorocarbons as non-toxic refrigerant, and he first used them when Chiron entered Taurus, but we now know that they damage the ozone. So these new scientific breakthroughs during this Chiron Aries had a direct impact on the environment. And a huge chapter in the history books was the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918. So that's 3 pandemics in 3 consecutive Chiron and Aries. Of course, there was the technology. Many people owned cars for the first time. Cars brought the need for good roads. So there were the technology of automobiles increased the building of roads, the connecting other people. The transmission of voice over the radio waves brought the world close to home, and over the telephone wires connected family with friends. A friend of mine used to joke that the telephone's party line was the internet of the 1920s. So we were being connected by the new technology. But a lot of the negatives of the new technology, think of all the pollution from automobiles, for example. Think of the radio waves. Some people are equating the various type of waves as possibly be damaging on some cellular level. The telephone wires connecting family and friends, there has been complaints about the way that's handled, the interference with all sorts of things. And we didn't have problems if with the telephone line or the power line coming down and hitting your house or a car or whatever and being dangerous before we had those lines. To make a long story short, if you want to understand Chiron and Aries, look at what's happening now and explore the events of the previous 2 transits and search for commonalities. I just don't have the time to explore them all, but these are those dates again. We're in the present one till about 2026. It was 1968 to 76, 1918 to 1926. We could probably find some more if we went back even further, but the further back in time we go, the less details we have. So I thought I'd keep it with people who are alive today or have memories of what their parents and grandparents might have told them. Now, a lot has changed about how we see Chiron since we first began studying it. The astronomical Chiron we thought we knew in the late 1970s and early 80s is in many ways a different entity than the Chiron we now know today. And our astrological understanding of this body have also evolved over the years. By the way, many of you will recognize that the person in this picture is David Bowie. If I have time, I will talk about his chart at the end, as he was born with an exact to-the-minute Chiron square Saturn. Anyway, the Chiron you'll be using tomorrow is in many ways much deeper, much richer than we ever dreamt of when we started exploring it in charts more than 40 years ago. To understand how the astrological Chiron has evolved, we need to explore some of what we've learned about its astronomy over the years. This is the title of an article that appeared in Sky and Telescope magazine many years ago, spinning the tale of how our image of Chiron was changing right in front of our eyes. In February 1988, Chiron was a fair bit away from the sun when a very strange thing happened. It began to get brighter. and it was soon 75% brighter than it had been months before. Why was Chiron suddenly so bright when it wouldn't be closest to the sun for another 8 years? The answer came the following year. Astronomers announced that they discovered a coma, a halo around Chiron, made up of thawed gases and frozen crystals, which made the body reflect more light than before and meant it was actually a comet. They gave it a comet designation of 95P/Chiron, but they chose to also keep its minor planet number. It was, it seemed, a bit of both a comet and a minor planet, kind of fitting for a body named after a being that is part human and part horse. Most comets include water ice as the main volatile ingredient in their makeup, and water starts to melt and the comas begin to form, and usually in the vicinity of the asteroid belt. But Chiron has little or no water in its makeup. Rather, it includes gases like methane and cyanogen, which are frozen for most of its orbit. As it starts moving close to the orbit of Saturn, the crystals begin to melt, liquefying as it moves closer to us than Saturn. So it begins to develop this coma as it gets close to Saturn. In 1993, they detected a very small tail behind Chiron, further proof that it was indeed a comet, but a very unusual one. It has a mass that is so huge, the astronomers decided that it had been captured by the pull of Saturn and Uranus before it had ever had a chance to blossom into a full comet with a gloriously long tail. Its mass is about 10,000 times that of a regular comet like Halley's Comet. With such a powerful mass, it has a gravitational pull, quite strong. It's so strong that when Chiron starts moving closer to the sun and the surface ice begins to melt, most of it hangs around the body, held there by the gravity. Only the smallest amount trickles off, some of the lighter ingredients. And then as Chiron moves away from the sun and starts cooling down, the vapor condenses, drops back to the surface, and refreezes. It is the only known comet large enough to do that. At this rate, unless something knocks Chiron from its current orbit, it will remain basically a large comet nucleus for millions of years before it loses enough mass to let go of the particles and make a tail. One of the things I just want to mention is that the reason that it got bright in unusual places because suddenly the crystals were reflecting more light than they had been when they were on the surface. While we were discovering that Chiron was a comet, a few other things were going on that also changed how we looked at Chiron. I love this next one. In October 1988, an article was published by some researchers showing that they had found Chiron's cave. And what's more, there was an actual historical Chiron about the year 1300 BC. This Chiron wasn't a centaur, but he was a tribal chief who invaded northern Greece riding on horseback. It seems in those days the Greeks only used horses as draft animals. And when the invaders arrived, the people, never having seen anyone riding a horse, saw in a distance creatures that looked like they had human heads and horse bodies. Most interestingly, this historical Chiron, after the invasion, settled down and became part of the area, and he set up shop using his medical knowledge to treat injuries and diseases. So the first Chiron, who was a healer, was a real human being who happened to be first seen riding on a horse. I have this article. If anybody has an interest and they would like to read the whole article, I will be happy to email it to them. Just, drop me a note. A few years later, in 1992, an astronomer found another body between the orbits of Saturn and Uranus, and they initially thought it was so like Chiron that one astronomer named it Son of Chiron, or nicknamed it. Upon further study, it had a number of unique traits of its own, such as a dark red color. And I mentioned earlier that it almost went to Neptune in its orbit. It was named after Pholus, another centaur. And Pholus, unlike Chiron, was not immortal, but he was another good guy. He was a decent centaur. But it was enough like Chiron, astronomers decided to create a new category of orbit crossing minor planets, centaurs. So now Chiron was no longer alone. And the following year, another centaur was discovered and named after the centaur Nessus, who happened to be a really nasty centaur, but that's another story. So it seems that Chiron was the leader of a herd. However, he was the largest centaur and the only one that was a comet, or so we thought at that time. Next shock came when astronomers got some precise readings on a centaur that had been discovered in 1997. The centaur Chariklo, who was named after Chiron's wife, Chariklo, turned out to be larger than Chiron. So now Chiron became the second largest Centaurean body, which begs the question, could Chariklo be at least as important in astrology as Chiron? So yes, I've been researching Chariklo as well as Chiron. Her orbit is between Saturn and Uranus completely. It does not cross either orbit. It is a fairly more stable orbit and a makeup that is probably not a cometary. If anything, she is more like a planet that Coel thought he had found than Chiron is. I'm going to talk about her a little bit more in a second. In 2005, astronomers were studying a centaur named Keklis they had found 5 years earlier. They were stunned when in December they saw a massive cometary outburst from this body. Keklis had showed no previous cometary nature, but it was clear that this event, from this event, that here was another centaur that was a comet. So Chiron was not the only one. And here you thought Chiron was totally unique. Astronomers were used to planets with rings. After Uranus was found to be a ring planet in 1977, and then rings were found around Jupiter in 79, and Neptune in 1984, it was starting to seem that rings were the norm in the solar system rather than the exception. But they had never seen a planet with rings, a minor planet with rings. That is until 2013, when Chariklo was found to have 2 of them. And then 2 years later, they found rings around Chiron as well. And so far, it's the only known comet that has rings. Here's something to think about. You may have heard that Saturn has been gradually losing its rings and may one day have no rings at all. They're disintegrating, falling to the surface of the planet. It won't be in our lifetime when they're completely gone, but it's something nobody ever expected. Chiron and Uranus rings are not currently disintegrating. They're staying. So what does it mean that the Chiron and Uranus will have rings perhaps after Saturn no longer does have rings anymore? Something to contemplate. I think this is a good time to stop and take some more questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and look at the chat room and take a drink of my coffee. Okay. I don't see any more questions. Does nobody have any more questions? All right. I'm going to speak briefly about the other question that was asked that I didn't answer before. What might you say about those of us who were born around the time of Pholus was discovered? My thought is that when a person is born around the time of a new body being discovered, that body is very important in that person's chart because it's suddenly it's almost like they are, there's a connection to it. I know people that were born around the time of Chiron's discovery, and they have many tales to tell about Chironic type events in their life. Sometimes even if Chiron doesn't do any major aspects in their chart, it seems like Chiron's awakening at that time that they were born is like they have an extra something in their life that people before them didn't have. So I think with Pholus, people born during Pholus, it's the same thing. I've got information on my website on Pholus. So at the end of this talk, I will give the link to my website, and you can go to the Pholus section and you can read about it, see some keywords for it. But I think basically when you're born around the discovery of something, it is particularly important to you because like you awakened in this incarnation at the same time our awareness of that body did. I don't want to give anything very specific because obviously everybody's Pholus is different. If you're born in the exact moment that Pholus was discovered, then you would have the same chart as Pholus. But other than that, you have a different Pholus than the next person. But the keywords, as I mentioned, are on my website, as well as information on the discovery, the orbit. So I'll let you explore that if you want to learn more about Pholus. Okay, I've got Chiron exactly square my Saturn, closest aspect in my chart, but I have never come to a satisfactory understanding of it. Okay. I'll give you a real quick description of Chiron square Saturn. And then if you're interested, message me, email me later, and I'll send you a couple of paragraphs that I wrote on this aspect. Chiron, as you know, is between Saturn and Uranus, and Saturn is the structure, the order, the apparent reality. It's the reality that we think we know. And Chiron square Saturn basically is a person who is constantly being placed in situations where they have to question reality. That it's almost like they learn that this is the way things are in school, and suddenly something happens and the rug is pulled out from under them. They land on their butt really hard, and they realize, well, that's not the way things are. And it happens again and again and again until the lesson is learned that reality is not a fixed thing, but rather we have a subjective reality. Things are the way we see them. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the actual reality. I've often felt that a lot of the things attributed to Saturn are the apparent of things that are actually Plutonian. So, for example, back in the ancient times, Saturn had to do with death, and but now we give death and rebirth to Pluto in a lot of ways, and so Saturn could be the apparent end of something but it's not really ending. It's going on in a new form as it changes through Pluto. So if you have Chiron square Saturn, you are one of the people that have to learn that your subjective reality is simply that, and not to hold on to it, but be open to the fact that from one day to the next, things are going to be changing. Basically, it says you need to be adaptable. And once you've learned that lesson, you can then help other people with the same thing, help other people realize that it's their perceptions rather than the reality. Any other questions? No? All right. We'll take a short break for a moment, and I'll be right back. Okay, let's see here. We got one more question just popped up, and then I'll go ahead and pick up the talk again. Chiron is transiting my ascendant conjunct Eris. I'm also having my second Saturn return. Both indicate change, birthing of sorts, but how might I distinguish the two energies? That's a very good question. Saturn return is basically something we all go through around the same time. It's consistent. If you've ever read a book by Gail Shee called Passages, she's not an astrologer, but she talks about events that are age related, things that happen to everybody around the same age. And so everybody goes through Saturn return. It's a time of going from one phase to another. The first Chiron return is like when you stop being the child, listening to it, everything your parent figures have told you, accepting some of it, rebelling against other things that they've said. And the second Saturn cycle is the time when you begin to be your own parent. You start deciding what to keep and what to throw out from all the lessons that your parents or parent figures try to teach you. So, in my opinion, the first Saturn return is when you become an adult. The second Saturn return, you've been with a child and an adult, and now you have a chance to look at your entire life, and it's a time when you go through, oh God, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done that. And you basically, on one level or another, you start making plans for the rest of your life. So you're no longer just an adult. You're now hopefully an elder at this point. If you really learned from what's happened to the first two Saturn cycles, you now have wisdom that you can give to other people. Chiron transiting the ascendant is a time when you have the opportunity to see things in a new perspective. Stephen Forrest once said that the ascendant is the stained glass window we see the world through, which I've always liked that. And when Chiron passes over here, it's like saying, okay, do you know that here's something you hadn't seen in the world? Here's something that maybe you hadn't thought about. It's also focuses a lot of your attention on the things that you might not have felt comfortable about yourself. Maybe you didn't like something about your appearance or something like that, and gets you to look at that and wonder if it's something that needs to be changed. Chiron passing over Eris, I have less I can say about that simply because we've only had Eris for less than 2 decades. And so I don't have a rich body of information to have on it. But I will say that if you have Eris conjunct the ascendant, you're a little bit of a troublemaker. Not in a bad way, but there is room in this world for people who rock the boat. And Chiron passing over Eris, if Eris is so prominent in your chart, is like a little extra kick to you have something, a cause maybe that comes across to you, that something, a reason you want to rock the boat, something that is bigger than yourself, something that you maybe had not even thought about before, or a new perspective on something. I happen to be married to a Chiron conjunct, a Eris conjunct ascendant person. And I can tell you from personal experience that anytime she joins a group, an organization, or whatever, she always stirs things up. And sometimes just by being herself and talking normally, she stirs things up. Uh, so you are a person who has that quality that you stir things up. The responded, yes, I speak the elephant in the room often. I like that. Yeah, we often don't want to pay attention to the elephant in the room. We need somebody to tell us it's there. All right, I'm going to get back to the rest of the talk. After learning about all these discoveries, it's just not possible to look at the astronomical Chiron in the same way as before. And this means that our astrological understanding of this body has had to evolve and deepen as well. So let's look at Chiron astrologically. What does it mean, and what do we know about it now after so many years have passed? Perhaps one of the most important ideas for Chiron has always been that it's a key. Keys come in all shapes and sizes, but they are all enable you to gain access to some place or something. If something is locked and you have the correct key, you know you can use it to unlock the door, the box, or whatever is closed off. One who has the key actually also has control. He can keep others from opening the door and therefore keep them from solving the problem, unless the key is necessary to both open and lock a door. When we learned that Chiron's surface begins to melt and impurities leave and then it refreezes, it told us more about how the key works. Chiron presents you with the opportunity to open a door so that you can do some internal house cleaning, rid yourself of old hurts, wipe away anger that is eating you up inside. But the door does not remain open. Chiron's key must be used again and again. Perhaps another way to look at this is that Chiron shows us we're always becoming more whole, but we never get to the end. We're always becoming. We never are complete. There's always more work to do. So when you see a Chiron aspect and something is happening, it's not an isolated incident. It's part of a whole spectrum of events that will be happening. If you believe in reincarnation, it may be continuing from a past existence and on into another one. You get another chance to use the Chiron key later on. What is most important about a key is the recognition of its existence. Before you realize that the key exists, you may not have even noticed there was a door. Astrologically, then, one might not know there was a problem or believe that there is a solution to a problem. But once the key is discovered, the first step has been taken. If you have the key, that's the first step. Locks come in all shapes and sizes, but turning Chiron's key can enable you to understand one small piece of information that makes everything else come together, one little bit that opens your eyes to a problem solution. The key is also used to denote a small electric switch that turns a circuit on and off. On a smaller scale, it's the little switch in a computer program that goes from 0 to 1. Size is not important, except that the key must be the right size for the specific lock. What does it mean for the world when Chiron's in a sign? As I said when we talked about Chiron and Aries, as Chiron passes through a sign, issues and problems related to that sign are in our face. People of the world over are worrying over some types of problems that relate directly to the energies of that sign, or are focusing their energies on attacking problems with methods shaped by those energies, or in some cases doing their best to fight against the issues that arise. The obstacles they are trying to overcome are major issues and preoccupy people's minds. These obstacles can be things that have been let go for too long and they must now be taken care of, or they could be the result of changes in the world that cause restructuring or redefining of issues. But whatever the problems are, the feeling is that now they must be dealt with. The nature of the sign sets up a scenario that will shape the child born at that time. Imagine a young child born right now with Chiron and Aries. Their first concern with the parent is now. The issues that concern the parent dominate their mind and their behavior, or at the very least, are much higher in importance than other concerns. And because the child has no experience with the parent until now, it picks up on the concerns. It picks up on how important these issues are. Or maybe not consciously, but if you're a child and you see your parents always fretting or about something or always talking about it to each other, or always riveted to the television when certain news stories come on, it has an impact on just how important these issues are and how much the parent does not pay attention to the child because of these issues. That's also important. The child's mind becomes imprinted with the magnitude of these problems. On some level, the child is shaped by what the parents are worried about. Chiron's house position puts a priority on a particular area of life. Aspects to Chiron personalize it, defining the impact on the child from their specific parents or other role models. Let's talk about imprinting for a moment. The imprint of a parent on a child was first studied in the 19th century. It was popularized in the 20th century by an animal behaviorist, Conrad Lorenz. He noticed that geese became attached to the first thing they saw after hatching. In Lorenz's case, the geese imprinted on him and treated him like a parent, following him around. And speaking from personal experience, when I was a little boy, I bought a duck. Now, I lived in a city. I lived in a row house. Duck is the wrong pet for that kind of person, but I bought it anyway. And I remember the duck used to follow me down the street everywhere I'd go, just like I was daddy. What's interesting though is that this is a very frequently referred to definition of imprinting. Uh, it's called filial. I can't pronounce it. Filial imprinting. Research on humans, however, shows that imprinting is not as time sensitive and context limited as it is in other animals. Instead, developmental psychologists generally talk about critical stages of development in which it is more likely that a child will learn something. For example, children not exposed to language or social interactions during the first few years of life may never develop typical social skills. Kids who grew up in such deprived environment are sometimes called feral children. Imprinting was thereafter considered a psychological process. As parents, we were constantly imprinting our emotions, our attitudes and biases, our values and principles, and our habits and preferences through every interaction, consciously or unconsciously, positively or negatively. We even mold our child's developing brain. In fact, 90% of the growth of the human brain occurs in the first 5 years of a child's life. The largest influence is through the child's emotional life, impacted directly by his or her caregivers. By creating a safe, secure, and loving home, you maximize the child's brain development and help develop a confident self-esteem through loving imprints. Some imprints are very positive. Healthy bonds guarantee development of a fulfilling life filled with healthy relationships and healthy self-esteem. Some imprinting can be damaging to the future adult. Insecure attachment sets them on the path toward insecurity, low self-esteem. Negative bonds between parents and children create destructive behavior and great anguish. And perhaps the worst of all are the imprints created when the child sees something as being rejected or abandonment. And a parent who leaves during childhood and adolescence uh, has a great effect on the development of the child. It may not always be a physical leaving. They may be there, but leave as far as the child is concerned. They stop paying attention to the child. A parent who is present physically but emotionally absent can be felt by the child as betrayal. But as we learned that part of Chiron's journey, when we learned that Chiron's journey is a change in its physical makeup, that it melts and freezes and it loses a little bit of the impurities, we learned that imprinting is much deeper than we thought. This next part boggled my mind. A few years ago, a landmark study at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver concluded that anxiety and stress level of parents actually left an imprint on the children's genes. And this imprint lasts into adolescence, thus has an influence on shaping their formative years. The impact occurs through a chemical process called methylation, which acts like a light dimmer for genes. Each gene can be totally turned off or totally turned on or anywhere in between. And the parent's influence on the child emotionally, psychologically, can actually cause these dimmer switches to activate and dim or turn off certain genes. It gets pretty complicated. The influence of the father's stress on the child is higher in their toddler years than it is in their infancy. A mother's stress level is higher during infancy than the father's influence. Mom's stress affects adolescence more than a dad's stress. One more thing, while the mother's stress level affects boys and girls equally, the father's stress level impacts daughters more. So we now know the relationship between parents and children not only affects their development in the common sense way we've been studying, but it actually influences the way genes function. In the past, your DNA was seen as a blueprint. It had a one-way conversation with the world. In fact, it's a two-way conversation, and the environment is telling it how to behave. Now, a person is born with 25,000 genes, and each of these can be expressed at a different level. What this shows that the early life experiences leave an actual physical imprint, positive or negative. You cannot undo psychological imprinting or the changes in your genes that were growing up. You are what you become as a result. Just like this tree in this picture, I have no idea what caused it to grow in such a twisted way, but if you saw the whole tree, you realize that at the top it was healthy, and it was every year it would continue to grow. But something happened to change it, and it would never be a straight tree. And what has happened to you to make you what you are will not, you can't undo it. Healing does not include undoing what wounded you in the first place. The loss of a parent in one way or another is a special type of loss. You can overcome the loss of your keys or even your favorite toy, but it's impossible to overcome the loss of a parent. Processing and managing the imprint of a parental abandonment requires forgiveness, and this isn't easy to achieve. If our environment constantly punishes the father figure, or if we observe great pain in our mother, our siblings, or our grandparents, we'll probably project the same pain within ourselves. Learning that Chiron has a ring has also helped us understand that if we fence off the bond of suffering and we consider each occurrence separately, we can achieve a greater understanding of what has happened. Rather than thinking of everything that happened to you as one large series of events, think of each one as a separate little incident and focus on healing from the pain from that one. Do it in steps. That's one of the lessons we learned from Chiron. This will help us stop storing up the pain on each separate incident. And every time you release the pain, your steps are lighter for the rest of your journey. Children born in the world today often have a particularly painful wound of rejection, which often one the parent does not realize. Sometimes we're made to feel we just aren't worth our parents' time or attention. The parent is so caught up in the important issues that their Chiron sign that they just don't seem to have time for the child. And that's very painful. This cartoon pretty much says it all. Okay, let's get back to Chiron imprint. As I mentioned, the child's mind becomes imprinted with the magnitude of the problems the parent is dealing with, and also, it seems, the stress levels of the parents. Dealing with these issues, solving the problems is a priority one, as well as the level of anxiety and stress. The child learns that nothing must stand in the way of resolving any difficulties in these areas. It becomes a deeply ingrained personal imperative which stays with the child the whole life long. But it also is a wound. How the child feels the adults credit them with the ability to handle these issues can be part of it. How the child feels they are compared to others in the way they handle the issues, siblings, peers. How the child feels the issues are more important than they are, perhaps the rejection or abandonment. Chiron can point to one's deeply rooted weaknesses and insecurities where we might feel ineffective, wounded, guilty, or otherwise unable to express ourselves naturally and confidently. At the heart of most Chiron wounds is the feeling we're just not good enough or deserving enough. And facing the wound and the dragons that come with it becomes our lifelong personal hero's journey. Carl Jung once wrote that the shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part, inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors and so comprise the whole historical aspect of the unconscious. The shadow can include good qualities and abilities the person does not accept in themselves, but it's the most negative aspects that get the most attention. It is our nature to repress our shadow self, and this is where the wounds dwell. It can become the most destructive, insidious, and dangerous when it is not accepted. When you do not accept, when you cover over, when you bury uh, parts of yourself because you just can't stand them or because you think that there's something wrong with you, it comes back to bite you. Trying to eradicate the shadow does not work because, as Jung discovered, ego and the shadow basically come from the same source. They balance each other. I'd like to show you a brief clip here. This is from a movie called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this scene explains what happens when you first face the negative issues of your shadow for the first time. Chiron's placement in the chart can reveal a core wound that may take a lifetime to work through. You may have to face many aspects of your shadow in the healing process. But Chiron's placement is also our secret power. As we grapple with pain, we gain wisdom that we can pass on to others. Once you start identifying what is your personal wound and spend time healing it, you become a positive force for others and can help others heal their own traumas. The sign that it's in at the moment of your birth can indicate how and where in your life you'll feel yourself falter from time to time. For example, if you find that Cancer is where Chiron is, you may struggle with issues of a maternal or domestic nature. Perhaps you have a strained relationship with your mother, or you find it difficult to empathize with others. Or if Chiron appears in Leo, you might be rather reserved and hesitate to express yourself. In other words, with a celestial body in a given sign, that sign usually viewed with certain strengths or personality traits may not come easily to you. There are many keys to Chiron's nature, and we discovered early on, which are still valid now, but that have added levels to their meaning. For example, let's take a bridge or stepping stone connecting the past with the future. Remember how Saturn, Chiron, and Uranus all have one thing in common: rings. Visualize that Saturn's rings are connected to Chiron and Chiron's rings to Uranus. Viewed that way, you can easily imagine Chiron as a pathway going through a chamber or tunnel with Saturn and Uranus at the openings. If Saturn is the old and the past, and Uranus the new, the future, what connects them is the present. So one of the things Chiron tries to help you do is to live in the present, not dwell in the Saturnian past, or not spend your time dwelling in the future you hope will be, but living in right now, learning from the past and preparing for the future. The essence of Chiron has always been to teach us lessons. Each in our own way needs to learn how to deal with what happened to us and also what we see is happening to others. Chiron forces us to solve seemingly impossible problems until we learn to step outside of them rather than being embedded with them. In Zen Buddhism, the master gives the students seemingly unsolvable or irrational challenges, such as, what is the sound of one hand clapping? The teacher, mentor, guru may be a person or a book or your higher self, or it could be you trying to face the issues you're imbued with head on. Whoever it is, whoever or whatever is your teacher, they're trying to get you to step outside of your pain and look at it with different eyes. But now you've heard that Joe Biden has selected Kamala Harris to be his running mate. If you look at the chart for the official announcement, Chiron is in the fourth house within minutes of the IC. We could view this as a horary question. Will the team of Biden and Harris win the election? In a horary or election chart, the president is usually assigned to the 10th. And I assume if we're talking about Biden and his running mate, then it would be, he would be the 10th and she would be the 4th. So if those rules apply here, the partner or running mate should be the 4th house. And Chiron on the IC should fit the selected candidate. So when I saw this, I would have expected that Kamala would have a strong Chiron. And sure enough, she has Chiron in the 10th house and quite elevated. I don't have time to do a detailed analysis, but one of the things Chiron in the 10th house gives her is once she feels she has found her niche, her career, she's driven hard. She drives herself hard. She takes her job seriously. It's given added importance by its close opposition to Uranus, Pluto, and Venus. It trines her Neptune, and it connects to her natal sun, moon. Opposition by sesquiquadrate, the former, and semi-square the latter. I guess you could say she fits the previous chart as that Chiron person. On election day, Mercury will go stationary direct, conjunct her sun, which tells me the day will bring some very significant news to her. And Venus in Libra will oppose the announcement Chiron as it crossed over the midheaven. So I don't want to jinx it, but I have a feeling the news is going to be good for Kamala and for Biden from that conjunction. A little aside, I noticed the announcement Chiron is very closely squared Trump's Mercury, and her Chiron quincunxes Chiron. Sounds like she touches some of Trump's wounds. Already he has called her nasty, phony, and the meanest U.S. senator. Can't wait to see if they get a chance to talk to each other one-on-one. Joe Biden also has a Chironic relationship with Donald. Here you can see that Joe's Chiron North Node, which happens to be square his sun, Venus, and ascendant, hits Trump's Mars ascendant. I think no matter what Trump says about Biden, he is actually really unnerved by his Democratic opponent. If the two debate, expect some nasty Mars outbursts from the Trumpster. How much time do we have left? I don't know. No.
You can go you can keep going.
Okay, I have some more I want to go. I just didn't want to run out of time. All right. Astrologers are used to predicting things based on planetary cycles, especially when it comes to Saturn. We know a person will have a Saturn hard aspect to Saturn about every 7 years, like clockwork. We can make definite predictions for everyone regarding age 7, 14, and 21 when Saturn squares, opposes, and then again squares its natal position. Chiron's orbit as a whole can be used for prediction. That is, Chiron returning to its natal place. The orbit averages about 50 and a half years, sometimes as little as 41 or as much as 51. So we'll talk about the return in a minute. That's a Chiron cycle, by the way, in case anybody wonders. This particular graph shows the age when Chiron squares its natal position for the first time. On the far left, at the beginning of Aries, you see that the person usually has Chiron square Chiron for the first time around age 19 and a half. Someone born with Chiron around 0 degrees Virgo, they could be 5.5 when they have the first square. Someone born with Chiron at 0 Pisces, they may be 23 or 23 and a half. So we can't look at Chiron, square Chiron, and say, at this age, because there is no age when it comes to that. Everybody's Chiron first square is different. Um, and I won't go into detail, but the first square is usually when there's the first awareness that something is changing in your world, and the opportunity to go in, into a different world in some way is given to you. There are several well-documented cycles that tie into Chiron's orbit. Perhaps the most positive is the Kondratiev cycle, and I don't speak Russian, excuse me if it's mispronouncing it. This cycle charts the ups and downs of the economy, but at the peaks there are discoveries or inventions that change the world in some way by opening new doorways, such as the steam engine, or most recently, information technology. One could say that each peak something was made available that solved some existing problems, but created new issues to deal with that didn't exist before or not a major concern. Another cycle is the cycle of war and political change. It's 25.049 years, which would be about one halfway through a Chiron orbit, and a second one at the completion of the orbit. I'm not sure this is chironic, but I mentioned it because of the third cycle on this slide. There was a documented 50-year cycle of violence. And what is most intriguing to me is that the peaks of each cycle coincide with the years of Chiron's aphelion, when Chiron is furthest from the sun, which will be happening this year. So in other words, Chiron in Aries, the Mars world sign, is when there is a peak in the 50-year cycle of violence. Maybe because it's the furthest away from peace-loving Libra. So these are long-range repeating cycles. I won't go into the perihelion today, but I think it's good to mention that Chiron's perihelion in Libra the last time was in 1945. We had the birth of the United Nations, whose goal was to unite the world in peace, but you also had the release of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an attempt to use the most destructive power on Earth to try to force the end of the war. So it was a powerful time when it was close, and maybe very grateful that it's a very short time, only a year and a half when it's in Libra. So one of the next significant Chiron events is a conjunction with the Saturn-Uranus midpoint. That'll be December 28, 2024. The last time this occurred was in 1907. April 17th, 1907 was the all-time busiest day for immigration in the US through Ellis Island, in the busiest year. That year, over 1 million immigrants came through. So at Chiron at Saturn-Uranus midpoint, the last time, there was this huge influx of immigrants coming into the US. On June 8th, 2028, there's another rare event, Chiron conjunct Saturn. The last time this occurred was in 1966. The news story, the last time Chiron conjunct Saturn was the magazine cover of Time. It was, "Is God Dead?" Also that year, the first partial mechanical heart was implanted in a human being, which led to a full artificial heart implant 3 years later. So these are next significant events if you want to put them in your long-range calendar, 2024, 2028. Now let's look at a completed Chiron cycle, Chiron return. At this point, Chiron has passed through every part of one's chart. One has experienced every possible healing opportunity from any angle, and has also had varying degrees trying to understand others who are wounded. It's now a time when you can use what you have learned, perhaps can teach others, perhaps help others to heal and become a wounded healer. One of my favorite examples of Chiron return is David Palmer. At the time of his Chiron return, he discovered that using hands to manipulate the spine could jumpstart healing, and he named this technique chiropractic. If you know any Latin at all, you know that Chiro means hands, and practice is chiropractic is the practice of using your hands for healing. Pretty fitting that he called it that at the time of his Chiron return. There's also a person named Röntgen who discovered X-rays. And if you've ever been to a chiropractor, you know that they always use X-rays before they begin to work on your spine. Interestingly, he discovered this medical tool, X-rays, around the time of his Chiron return. So for the last bit, I'm going to just go briefly through a few people that you may know or heard of who have had Chiron returns. Take, for example, Julia Child. Julia experienced a three-pronged Chiron return. It began when she was 49 3/4 of age, retrograded a few days before her 50th birthday, and made one more crossing when she was 50 and a half. At 49, she published her book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. When Julia was promoting her book the following year on a public television station, her own television career was launched. Many viewers wrote to the TV station wanting to see more, and soon the TV show The French Chef was launched on a local station. It went national the following year. She is recognized for bringing French cuisine to the American public. She didn't know anything about French cooking as a child. In fact, it was not until she met at age 34, shortly after Chiron opposed its natal place in her chart, the man who would become her husband, that she actually tasted French cooking for the first time. He took her to a French restaurant. I think it was on their honeymoon. She wrote of the experience, an opening of the soul and spirit for me. She went to cooking school, and after graduation began with 2 classmates to teach French cuisine to the American women in Paris. This is around the time Chiron sextile occurred. For the next decade, she traveled around Paris and then back to the US, collecting French recipes, translating them to English. But it was not until her Chiron return that her career took off. Note she has Chiron in the 10th. This man is Jack Cover. You may not have heard of him, but you've definitely heard of the invention he created when he was 50. Growing up, he was a fan of science fiction. And one of his favorite science fiction stories were those involving Tom Swift, where it's always inventing something new. In one of the books, Tom Swift had something that's called Thomas A. Swift's electric rifle. If you take the first letter from each of those words, T-A-S-E-R, that's what he named his discovery. A series of airplane hijackings led to sky marshals with sidearms being placed on planes. I don't know about you, but Cover saw a serious flaw in the idea of people with guns in planes. Around the same time, he said, I read an article in the Los Angeles Times about a man who had been frozen on a down power line for 4 or 5 hours. He wasn't harmed, but he couldn't release the wires. Cover talked to doctors, visited medical libraries, and discovered that not much was known about the effects of electricity on the human body. He spent a couple of years researching the subject and came up with the basic principle of the taser. He figured out to incapacitate someone, you needed high voltage but low current electric pulses. The wattage is small and discontinuous, under normal circumstances, far below lethal levels, but it's enough to cause muscles to contract uncontrollably, putting the recipient out of action. He said the goal was to devise a non-lethal means of stopping violent acts such as riots and hijackings. He was born in the year of Chiron's aphelion. Remember, I talked about violence. And he invented the taser at his Chiron return, again near the aphelion. Charles Darwin spent most of his life as a naturalist who kept to himself. But in 1859, at age 50, His book on the origin of species changed the scientific community forever. The book was written during his Chiron return, but published on the 24th of November, 1859. Chiron was 7 degrees past natal Chiron on that date, but transiting North Node at the publication was on his natal Chiron. It was also published on the day of the new moon in early Sagittarius, by the way, which was conjunct his natal Saturn. So that was the other centaur in the picture. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the talk. For those interested, here are links to some of my web pages and other information. So my website is zanestein.com/chiron.htm. I have links to a number of other sites on one of the subpages, page 7_B. My new book, and this is a picture of it to the left, is called Chiron, Healer and Homemaker. It's available from Amazon.com, both as a paperback and Kindle editions. So just if you're interested, log into Amazon.com and then type Chiron, Healer and Homemaker in the search engine. You can view a Kindle preview of the book by going to the next address I have on there. It'll take you through the first several pages of the book, including the foreword and the couple of other bits. You can also still get my first book, which is called Essence and Application, A View from Chiron. And I have a link on my website to where you can click to possibly order it. And if you want to contact me in relation to Chiron or some of the other things we've talked about, my address is mr.chiron@zanestein.com. And yes, I have many addresses. I think it's because I'm a Gemini with a Sag moon and a Pisces ascendant, so I'm just so damn mutable. And I guess I will very briefly talk about David Bowie's chart. If David's birth time is correct, Chiron could be said to be his strongest feature. First, there is that exact to the minute square to Saturn. While this aspect influenced a generation of people, those with it exact could be said to personify its nature. It has many levels. Perhaps the most important one is a growing realization, as I mentioned in the question period, that the definition of reality is temporary. It is very freeing, this awareness, which can lead the individual to write their own unique definitions and to change them as they see fit. But it's also square his moon and his ascendant-descendant axis. In essence, he had major lessons to learn about dealing with his feelings and expressing them around others, and this shaped how he viewed himself. As he learned to deal with his feelings, he began to reinvent himself, something he did often throughout his life. If you're a Bowie fan, perhaps you can remember the different characters he manifested. And you know, they were not just roles, but he actually was each one of these characters. Chiron makes a nice sextile to his Mercury, an extraordinarily active mind, one that did not believe in walls or limits. He would allow his curiosity to take him everywhere. One positive manifestation is a mind that saw potential in everything and everyone and truly appreciated people who are not normal by society's standards. Another is that he was able to see the humor in almost every situation. It was also Quincunx's Eris. We still have much to learn about this dwarf planet, but I feel having it in this aspect was one reason Bowie became an icon. He identified with the emotional chaos people carried around with him and drew his power from that deep wound. And that, I think, is it.
Wow, what a lot of great information about Chiron. Yay, thank you so much, Zane.
Welcome. So if anybody has questions that weren't answered, I gave my email address. It's also on my website. If you didn't take the time to jot that information down, just put Zane, Stein, Chiron in the search engine, and one of the pages will be mine.
And contact me by email if you want to a recording, to get a link to the recording. Right. Thank you again. Much appreciation, Zane.
Thank you, Zane. That was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Well,
Night,
everyone
everybody.
have a good night, everybody.